Hello, and thank you for tuning into Clandestine World War II. My name's Evan. So to start here, I thought I'd go over a quick review of a current production, or reproduction perhaps, of one of the most iconic weapons of this aspect of the war, the dagger part of the cloak and dagger involved in all this. And this is, well, it would be a Fairbarin-Sykes fighting knife, or dagger. It's named after its creators, William Ewart Fairbairn and Eric Anthony Sykes, a pair of what you might kind of just really want to call violence experts, based off of their experiences prior to the war, especially serving with the Shanghai Municipal Police in China, who were effectively, I can say, probably consultants for a lot of these clandestine organizations and these kind of proto-commando forces like the SAS, the SOE, the OSS, and they developed this weapon. So this particular example, this reproduction is what I want to go over. There's quite a lot of background information on the knife itself and its development, because like many tools that were created during the war, it evolved quite a bit. So this is a Sheffield production. It's one of the original manufacturers, and there were several manufacturers during the war, and they still produce these in this kind of original format. This is a reproduction of what would be a third pattern, evidenced by the kind of rib nature of the handle here. The scabbard with the metal tip, the tabs for being sewn onto whatever clothing you might desire. It's got a elastic keeper up at the top to keep the pommel secured down, make sure it's not going to rattle or flop out of the scabbard. It's got a belt loop back behind here. We'll get a good look at it here. So, couple of options available from the distributor that I purchased mine from. The blued example was out, and this was well described as a satin finish blade. As you can see, this is probably actually more of a mirror polish, which might seem a little bit odd considering that you would arguably, and many actually did, want the blued blade because it really reduces the glare. You can see under the light here, this is shining quite a bit. The bluing, the dulling of the reflectiveness of the blade was obviously ideal, although its creators actually argued for this idea that you would be striking out of the darkness and it's this like flash of steel, like just moments before it plunges into the poor soul who's being stabbed, but that it just absolutely terrifies them, and that like this actually shiny blade is what you really would want, which I think is debatable. But nevertheless, this reproduction actually I think is pretty good. The point on this thing is, I would say, probably the finest I have ever encountered on any weapon I've ever handled. This is not exactly like, needle sharp, but it is supremely fine, kind of belies what this weapon is intended for, which is thrusting. The edge that was on this when it arrived, I would call it serviceable. I would call it an edge. I'd call it an edge capable of cutting. I did see several reviews online, people complaining that it doesn't have an edge, and I think there's a lot of expectation, especially with things like this that have so much of a kind of pedigree behind them and a lot of expectation, therefore, that people think these are going to be, razor sharp and all of that. And for one, I don't think that you would want a razor's edge on even like a field or camp knife, like a K-bar or something like that. This was definitely not tomato slicing sharp by any stretch, and it doesn't really need to be. This is not really intended for cutting. You certainly can, and especially the point will do some cutting if you are slashing perhaps, but again, this is really designed for being thrust, for the stab. You can tell obviously for one, the incredibly fine point to which the blade tapers, and also if you look at this diamond shaped cross section, this creates a very, very rigid blade, and just kind of aids and helps it with the penetration. Not to mention, this is long. This is a 7-inch blade. This is going to go very deep into someone, is also given this degree of length to aid with penetration of clothing. Again, in like the Second World War, back then, before a lot of the fancy, really cool stuff that we have now. Wool was pretty de rigueur. Pretty thick wool uniforms were expected to be encountered. It's part of the reason why this is kind of exists in the shape and manner that it does. So to kind of continue with the review here, not sure if it's going to show up here, but it does bear a J. Noble and Son, Sheffield, England mark here on one part of the crossguard. You can see two of the MOD, Ministry of Defense, marks that are part of the cast aluminum handle. If I get back in frame here, no, these are showing up, but a couple other proof marks on the other underside of the crossguard. There's some slight gapping where the blade meets the crossguard. I think this is fine. On this particular example, the handle is perhaps a little bit off center, and the pommel nut here where it's threaded on is perhaps also slightly off center. I did see some people complaining about that, and I have to say that I think that that's actually fine. These were and are issued to comparatively smaller numbers of comparatively elite troops, but just like now, and just like then during the war, these are and were and are still mass manufactured objects. I think this is fine. So if you want to purchase one of these, especially because you have interest in this aspect of the war, this kind of, really emblematic dagger of all of the cloak and dagger sides of things, I'd say go ahead. This is a-okay. This is fine. It's really pretty fantastic. If you want to spend the money on some of the arguably better crafted reproductions that are out there, go for it. Those are going to be incredibly expensive, but for what this was, I got this for about $70. They're around there for around that price range, $70 to $100. This really is what these knives were, and if you want to just kind of possess one, you want to go out in your backyard and stab milk jugs and stuff like that, really, this is fantastic. So it's pretty simple. Coming up in the future, I'd like to do a video kind of overviewing the knife and its history and all that, so that'll be forthcoming at some point. But for now, just this simple review of this modern production example. Thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you next time.